So this one is called Who Wins War? Joint work with Jonathan Federle and Moritz Schulerich. So basically, if you think back, well, let's start maybe with the quote of Cicero. Cicero saying that the sinews of war are unlimited money. Le nerf de la guerre, c'est l'argent illimité. And so the idea being that basically it's all about, well, who wins wars is to a large extent about money. And if you think of key episodes in the history of the world, I mean, I used to listen to this Audible podcast, The History of Rome. It's like, well, it's a long history, so it's like 200 episodes. It's like interminable, the whole thing. It's rather fascinating. And what you see is that Rome would very often win their wars through deeper pockets. So they would fight against Hannibal, and Hannibal would kind of outsmart them. But eventually, they would kind of win just because of the logistics. They would be able to draw on more grain. They would use Egypt as a grain chamber, and that would kind of then fund their efforts. So at the end of the day, they would make it through economics rather than through tactics and Caesar making some smart move with their, you know. So and then if you look at World War II, it's a bit of a similar, where you see the big one of the big turning points in World War II was obviously after Pearl Harbor, when the US entered in the war and kind of to a large extent saved Europe, right? I mean, it was kind of the economic might of almost unlimited resources from the US that then kind of helped to get rid of Hitler, right? So in that sense, another big historical example with repercussions to all of us. So we're happy that it turned out that way. That illustrates the potential importance of money. So there is, of course, a literature on that in political science. So you have all this the IR scholars who study wars. And so we build on their literature, but one of the things that we had the impression that it's missing when we looked through the literature, but maybe Lisa or the other political scientists will tell us that we're wrong. But we had the impression that they would maybe not focus enough the existing literature on exogenous shocks. So there would be people who would look at kind of links between being rich and powerful and winning wars. But of course, there is some endogeneity to that. And what we want to do is extremely simple here. We want just to look at how do exogenous shocks to economic perspectives of a country affect their winning chances. And that's of course also relevant if you think of current wars. It's also to some extent about economic power of the different blocks. So that's pretty much what I was saying. So there exists a literature, but it would rather be in the paradigm of the realists, kind of focus on associations rather than exploiting exogenous shocks. And it is difficult to get at causality, of course, because you can have it's endogenous choice variable, the war efforts, and of course there are plenty of confounders. So what do we do? So in case you're fed up with my talk after a while and you fall asleep, so at least before that, the last thing you see before falling asleep is kind of the results. So you have we look at more than 700 militarized interstate disputes from 1977 to 2013. We exploit exogenous price shocks of about 300 products during these conflicts. So we look at the export and import patterns before the conflict starts, and we look at how these pre-conflict patterns then would kind of be changed through these exogenous world price shocks, and looking on price takers. And then, so what do we find? We find that, well, money plays an important role. So a 10% increase in windfall gains relative to GDP would increase the chances of winning instead of losing instead of a draw, or a draw instead of losing, by 3.2 percentage points. And then we look at the mechanism, and what we see in terms of mechanism is that when export revenues appreciate, you have more government revenue and you have more military expenditure. And so that kind of would be in line, I guess, with what many of us would expect, but well, there is some value in studying statistically. Yeah.
Do you also do like onset of conflict, like now I'm richer, I fight more?
Well, we may do it in a separate paper. I mean, there are some. So I have a paper with Caselli and Morelli where we look at oil asymmetry and conflict, and but there it's on onset. So on onset, you would have maybe already more things, right? You have maybe not on. So we have run some regressions. The results were interesting, but we didn't want to overpack the paper. So in the spirit of economics, one idea, one paper, and then let's see if we find time to do a spin-off. But
for us to understand this condition on the war going on.
Yes, exactly. So you will see an observation is basically a militarized interstate dispute. So a sample there's no peace in the sample. It's just each observation is a war, and we study who wins. Yeah.
Does it depend on the timing? Because military technology usually gets much more efficient during wars. So when you get the shock, and how you can translate it essentially in output?
So that's not something we've looked at, but that's an interesting question. So we could look at that. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so here I just start with one, with one example, but you can have like 500 of those. But here, if you look at the wars between Chad and Libya, what you had is the typical pattern where you had a rebel group in some remote area of Chad, and then Libya was start meddling a bit with the affairs of the neighboring country and supporting this rebel group. And so the first war that took place between Chad and Libya was won by Libya, and in the paper we have a bit of a case study where we talk about that, what happened exactly, and we have plenty of citations making the point that, well, that was kind of during a big oil price shocks linked to the Iranian revolution as well. Gaddafi was kind of swimming in cash, and that was helping the cause of winning this war. So there are plenty of historians making this point. And then the second war took place in another period where basically Saudi Arabia was kind of producing much more oil, and according to analysts, the price level of petrol went down to the Kurno equilibrium, where basically the OPEC cartel was not working anymore, and plenty of historians then pointed out that Libya was not able to pay anymore for Soviet weapons, and they cut credit, and they were in trouble, and in that period they lost the war. This is not causal. This is just an illustration of the kind of situation that we study. And now we're going to look at this more in more depth. So you have plenty of other such examples. Given that I tend to be slow and chatty, I'll kind of skip a few of the slides, because otherwise, I'll never finish. Although I don't have that many slides, but otherwise we can go back to every detail. So there is this big literature on commodity price shocks. So there are some on government revenues, and then there are many on civil wars. So many people here in the room actually, Owen, Matthew, if he's still around, plenty of people in the room have contributed to this literature as well. But we believe that in our context, this hasn't been used in that sense. Then there is this literature kind of showing that economic power rhymes with interstate war outcomes. So there's this whole field of realists in international relations in political science that kind of focus on these things. But again, what we add to that is kind of the focus on exogenous shocks. So a first part of what we do is we don't have that many different components of the analysis. One is kind of trade data. So these are prices from trade, and then revenues where we use the Harvard Atlas of Economic Complexity. You will be unsurprised to learn that it's mostly my macroeconomics co-authors who are fully on top of this data rather than me. So this is kind of the data on the commodity imports and exports. And then we have a variety of macro variables from a variety of sources, military expenditure, GDP, external debt, inflation from World Bank, government revenues from IMF, population data. And for the militarized interstate disputes, we use the MID, the standard the data set that also several of us have used in previous work. So this would code smaller and bigger disputes. So you have the highest level of intensity 5, that is a war, and then you have it goes down up to 0, and the higher you got, the more intense the whole thing is. And we will also obviously do robustness analysis with respect to restricting to really very intense conflicts or less intense conflicts as well. Yes, so then this variable has a very interesting feature. It codes who wins the wars, which is for civil wars not, some of the civil war data like ACLED, they have something like battles won, battles lost, headquarter established. So you could do maybe something like that for civil wars, but for civil wars it may be harder. So the data is less immediate on who wins wars. Here for interstate disputes, it's pretty clear cut. So they code a variety of possible outcomes, and we just use the ones that are clear, where either one party has militarily won a war or received concessions from the other side. And if nothing happens in terms of concessions or winning, if it's coded as stalemate in their data, etc., then we code it as a draw. Yeah, so these are kind of the outcomes we focus on. This is the distribution of conflicts over time. The fact that you have fewer at the end simply is due to the fact that to be in the data, you need already to have an outcome. So if you have a war starting in dispute starting in 2014 and it ends in 2017, well, then it's not in the data because we don't know the outcome yet. So now then it's the nitty-gritty bit about kind of defining windfall gains. So basically, as I was saying before, the unit of observation is a conflict. So we have these dyadic conflicts, small d. That's the unit of observation. The conflict starts in a given year t and lasts for some duration LD. And then we have a pair of opponent countries in a dyadic pair, which we call a pair O that contains countries A and B for a given conflict D. And so we will be able to do things like dyad fixed effects or these kind of things, as you will see. And so we have trade-specific variables. So we have the set of commodities that the countries import and export traded at a price PC for commodity C in a year T, and XCTA denotes the opponent A's, the party A's value of net exports of commodity C in a year T. So you have these 300 commodities. The Swiss would export cheese and chocolate, and so if they're in a war against, if Switzerland is attacked by, say, France, for example, then if the chocolate price goes up, then Switzerland would benefit from that, to give an example, a fictitious example. So then what we do is we calculate this delta VDA variable, which is the appreciation of A's, country A's, pre-conflict net exports due to a price change during the dispute D. So basically, we do the sum over all commodities and over all years in which the conflict is ongoing, and we have in red the returns on a given commodity interacted with the pre-conflict net exports of the commodity. So for exogeneity, we take the pre-conflict commodity. So if before the war Switzerland exports 500 kilo of chocolate, then we take this as fixed, and the only thing that we use is the fact that during war chocolate price goes up. And so we have
Estimate like in the period of what Juan was doing with coffee, right? Colombia or Brazil has a very large share that they affect the commodity prices.
Yes. So we have robustness checks where we remove all country commodities where they are 10%, 5%, 2%, 1%, 0.1% of market market price share. And it's clear that, of course, I should say that this whole literature on the commodity shocks, I think, started with Dube Vargas, right? So that's your paper was really the precursor of as far as I understood, I think you were the first ones who came up with this idea. Yeah.
Why do you take it at the level of either part of the pair and not dyadic? So not how important is chocolate for Switzerland relative to how important it is for France?
So that's what we do. So it's basically we calculate a variable WD, which is the relative importance of these exports for Switzerland minus the relative importance of the relative change for the other country. So which would mean that for a dyadic war D, 0.01 would be the value change of net exports of party A relative to its GDP are 1% point larger than for country B. So that is kind of the dyadic difference between the two. And then, that slide I could also maybe skip. Windfall's WD conditional on war outcome. So if you look at the raw data, simply, what we see is that if you're a winning party, so that's descriptive statistics, so no causality here so far. So if you're a winning party, the windfalls in percentage are 8%, while for a draw it's 0. So you see a correlation in the raw data, and now we want to see where this comes from. And so the regression that we run, we start with simple OLS. And so basically on the left-hand side, we have QPT. So that's the outcome of war. So it's 1 if A won, it's 0 if it's a draw, and it's -1 if A lost. And so we want to explain this outcome with WPT, which is the windfall difference in a country pair P in the year T. And so again, as I was saying, all the observations are dyadic conflicts. And then we have a vector of controls with where we control for a variety of variables at the country per year level. We have a fixed effect at the country pair level, and we have a fixed effect at the year level. And we cluster the standard errors at the diet level. So it's a very simple regression that we run. Yeah.
Clarifying question. So you can imagine a countervailing mechanism theoretically, which is that wages go up in that sector that's affected. And so if you have a volunteer army, you have to pay higher wages to your fighters. Now, one way in which that doesn't matter is if you raise an army through conscription. So do you have data on whether it's conscription or volunteer armies? Maybe the effects could be different.
Yeah, no, I think that would be, I mean, so you know, we have issued a working paper, but we haven't submitted the paper yet because what we're looking for is to add a bit more meat on the bone. And the kind of thing that you suggest would be exactly the kind of meat that we look for to add to the bone. So we haven't done it, a great idea. And it's exactly the kind of thing that we could look at. Yeah. So these are the you know the first maybe main table, if you like. Conflict outcome to the left, the regression equation that I've shown before, and the windfall gains. And here you see a coefficient in the first column without controls, and then afterwards with controls, diet fixed effects, year fixed effects. You see the coefficient is similar. It's about 0.3, and so that would mean quantitatively what I said is like increase of 100% of these windfall gains would lead to a winning chance increase of 32%, and a 10% increase in windfall gains with respect to GDP would correspond to a 3.2% increase in winning chances. Yeah, so that's the then well, we do plenty of things. So we can look at market dominance, but I'll skip the details. But we can basically remove the big players. So we can remove Switzerland for chocolate and Colombia for coffee and etc. So we can and even if we remove them, what you see, I mean, the coefficient size and significance remains rather stable. Then we do placebo tests where we kind of randomly take starting years. We shuffle windfall gains. We do we remove excessively large wars. We try ordered logic. We account for the varying lengths by weighting the observations by war length. Some wars are much longer than others. Then we can also do one of the robustness check where we do is where we take the kind of concessions we remove these observations, and as winning we only use cases where there was really a military victory, because some of the concessions of course is hand coded, so they would if Hannes takes if Hannes threatens me and I give him my laptop, well, maybe it's sometimes it's not fully clear cut, so we can if it's hand coded, and so that's why the results also go through when we drop that category, and then we can also what we see is if we focus ourselves to bigger conflicts with hostility levels minimum 3 or minimum 4, the results, if anything, become slightly stronger. Then we can drop one conflict at a time, one diet at a time, countries, product groups, etc. Then in the interest of time, how much time do I have?
Yeah, first 4 minutes.
Okay, so then what we do, but I'll finish on time. So it's so then we want to look at the mechanism, and for looking at the mechanism, now we change the unit of analysis. Now we're not at the diet level anymore, but we're at the country level, the country year level, because we want to see what happens in a country year if you have these shocks. And so basically what we do is we look at the windfall shocks at the country level, and we look at as outcome variables military expenditures, government revenues, and external debt at the country I, and here T level with country fixed effects and with time fixed effects. And well, what you see is that military expenditures go up if you have positive windfall gains, government revenue goes up, and external debt goes down. And then if we if we split it by looking at these effects in times of peace versus in times of conflict, here I just showed the ones in times of conflict. In the paper you also have the ones for peace. But what you see is you see really stronger, quantitatively much stronger effects in times of conflict. So having if an increase of the chocolate price for Switzerland doesn't change much in times of peace, well, during times of war it makes a big difference. And so here you see the negative windfall effects would reduce military expenditures, and the positive ones would increase military expenditures. Yes, and so that's the response to military expenditure to 1% point windfall gains relative to GDP. So it increases by 0.1% military expenditures, which is quite sizable. So the German military expenditure today is 2% of GDP, and the US is 3%. So 0.1% is not nothing. Government, you see a change in government revenues, and what you see is when you look at the quantitative size of the coefficients is basically for the government revenue you have a 0.5 coefficient, and for military expenditure you have 0.1, meaning that a fifth of the money flowing in goes straight to the military. So if you're in conflict with a country and you have some positive export shocks, then the proportion of the money that flows right to the military is a fifth, which is much more than the 2% that we see in peace times in general. So it's almost approaching a logic of a war economy, if you like. And then for the external debt, the results are less clear cut. Yeah.
Can you do exchange rates?
So we could, yeah. I mean, exchange rates are a bit more. Exchange rates are a bit more endogenous, because if you, I mean, for example, Russia would manage to kind of stabilize the ruble in some periods. So you remember, in the last few years there was a discussion on what happens with the ruble, etc. So exchange rate depends on choice variables as well.
Thinking about like Dutch DCs, like these appreciating the exchange.
Ah, okay.
Generating internal.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So exchange rate. Yeah. Good point. Yeah. So to conclude, well, we find that money matters for winning outcomes of war. Yeah, so let me stop here. Thanks a lot for your attention. Hannes, yeah.
So, it would be nice to see like the country characteristic of these things. And what I'm worried about is that countries that have lots of friends also trade more, have higher shares, and therefore price swings affect them stronger compared to their GDP. So it would be interesting to see like what kind of countries have large swings, what kind of countries have small swings. And then of course, like I think what you're saying is also that developed countries are more likely to have very small swings, and like developing countries have much more likely to have large swings, I think, right? Because the GDP is smaller, and like, do you see this like effect being more driven by like Rwanda, or Uganda, I don't know what, or like is this more like, is this Russia or Ukraine? Would be interesting to, from these both perspectives, from identification perspective, but also to know like where's your kind of, what does your story apply to mostly?
Yeah, no. So I think, I mean, in terms of the the country and diet characteristics. So we have diet fixed effects, which of course filter out some of the things, but of course it's not perfect. And however, the heterogeneous effects are between income levels are really interesting, right? And it's again the kind of comment that can add a lot of meat to the bone and additional results without so much additional efforts from our side. It's one line in data, right? So it's true that it's a good idea to do that. Yeah, we should do that. Yeah, maybe Juan first, and then Uwe, and then you tell me when I should stop, Oliver, because yeah. Okay.
This is extremely interesting. Thank you. It would be interesting to know. I mean, so these countries they have an export boom, but so depending on a lot of factors, the money can access more or less of these resources, right? So it depends on whether these are countries that tax exports. It depends on whether these commodities are exploited by multinationals or local firms, and it depends on whether the country actually owns part of the exporting sector or not. So I mean, heterogeneities along these dimensions would be much more informative and as you said, provide more meat to the bone.
Yeah, no, I think that's very relevant. I mean, there's this great APSR paper where they focus on the impact of oil depending on whether it's a national oil company or not a national oil company. So they find that the results that we found in our papers on the impact of oil on conflict, that they are that they depend on the ownership structure of the oil company. So it's a cool paper, and it's true that we could do something along those lines. I think that's a very good idea. Haven't done it yet.
Yeah, thanks. I had a similar question. Plus, on top of that, so I agree. You have 300 goods groups, but then how do you deal with, for instance, Russia that can manipulate to a certain extent certain prices of natural resources, and that might be endogenous to how the war goes and how other countries are interfering with that. So how do you deal with that? And plus the size of these economies in the global context. So probably Russia is a different example than Austria would be.
Yeah, so what we do is we do plenty of robustness checks. So one of the robustness checks is we remove information from if you're a dominant producer of something, where we in our calculation, if something happens and you have a market position above restricted net export share to be less than 10%, 5%, 1%, 0.1%, where we kind of remove these price makers to just have price takers. And then we also have robustness checks where we drop one country at one country at the time, or one dispute at the time, one diet at the time, or some product groups at the time. So where basically we want to make sure that it's not just driven by the US or just driven by oil or just driven by this or that. Yeah. Well, maybe there are some more hands, but let's do that maybe over the coffee break. No, so in order to not monopolize. Yeah.